All right. And we can begin the session. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this seminar. As you know, it is the last from our series of webinars on the turning point or the critical point in the migration studies that we held with Camille Schmoll, who is here today, and Thomas Lacroix, who will arrive a bit late because he has another meeting now. And today we were supposed to have two presentations, one from Peggy Levitt and the other one from Claire Zalk. But we are sorry to announce that Claire Zalk had to cancel because, well, she couldn't join us today. So we'll have only one presentation from Peggy. Thank you very much, Peggy, for coming and for being here with us. So I will present you briefly and then leave you the floor in order to do your presentation. Camille, do you want to say a word before, or shall I carry on?
No, I leave you the floor.
Okay. Okay, so just two words on Peggy Levitt, for if there is some people who don't know her, but she's already a well-known sociologist. She's a professor of sociology at Wellesley College, and she's also at Harvard University. And she's a co-founder with Maurice Kroll of the Global D Center, which is a kind of center that intend to bring together a growing network of scholars from across the world who are committed to producing new knowledge and using different epistemologies and methods by working collaboratively with a broad range of partners, which is a very interesting initiative. So Peggy writes regularly about migration, on the questions raised by transnationalism, arts, culture, religion, and even on social protection I've seen recently. So you published a book in 2015 called Artifacts and Allegiances, How Museums Put the Nation on the World on Display. And it is thematic that you will deal with today, as you will present a talk that you you worked on with Andrea Siliunas. And this talk is entitled Redefining the Boundaries of National Belonging Through Arts and Culture. And we will be very pleased to listen to you now. I leave you the floor.
Thank you so much. I want to first thank you both, Swanie and Camille, and also Thomas, for inviting me, and to stress that this is a co-authored paper with Andrea Siliunas, who I hope will be here and be able to participate in the questions and answers. We're grateful for the opportunity to share this work with you. They are ideas that we're thinking through, so we're excited to have this conversation. So what do national art and literature mean today, and what's their role in creating nations and repositioning them on the global stage? Historically, national cultural production helped create and consolidate nations and inspire loyalty among citizens. And while critics and scholars claim that contemporary art is intrinsically global, and what gets called world literature is literature that circulates and is meaningful outside of its original context, the labels national art and national literature are still prominent in the discourse and in the course catalog and in the bookstore and in the museum gallery. So what we're curious about, what we're trying to understand is, what do these really mean now, and what work are they trying to do? According to historians of nationalism, Nations first emerged in the 18th through the 20th centuries as imagined communities that saw themselves as culturally homogenous, territorially grounded, and sovereign. Under conditions of contemporary globalization, though, it's unclear whether and how traditional ways of understanding national belonging still shape people's identities, loyalties, and aspirations. So we argue that the global circulation of people, capital, images, and ideas has given rise to alternative ways of imagining the national community. The national and the transnational are produced in conversation with each other in various combinations at various times and distinctly across regions. Transnationalizing occurs, as Yasmin Soysal has written, when nation transcending frameworks, models, and standards transform national actors' orientations and strategies. This doesn't necessarily undermine the nation state, but can instead redefine its cognitive, cultural, and organizational premises. Our project explores how national culture has been transnationalized in the art and literary worlds of 3 countries, and in this way, transnationalizes the national imaginary. We make 3 primary contributions to the scholarship on culture and nationalism. First, we distinguish between several ways in which national culture is reconfigured through transnational relations. As scholars of long distance or transborder nationalism have argued, cultural and political elites may, on the one hand, build and activate ties with members of their diasporas by drawing on expatriates to strengthen the nation state's position in the world. Or on the other hand, it may be regional ties and identities that play a more important role in mediating between the nation and the world. The role of the region, we think, has been under-theorized in scholarship on nationalism and transnationalism. Second, we argue that the effects of these strategies vary across contexts. Although ties to the diaspora and the region are often used to strengthen the nation state, building its legitimacy and garnering international recognition through the export of national culture, they can also undermine the nation state's unity and viability, especially in contexts where multiple diasporas and regions compete for control. Third, we show how these long distance and regional nationalisms reflect and are reflected by the production and circulation of culture, driven forward by people, platforms, and policies in the literary and art fields of Buenos Aires, Beirut, and Seoul. By people, we mean the art makers and art managers working in and outside the country who contribute to its national cultural field. We see these individuals as vernacularizers who translate and adopt ideas and practices from various contexts so they're understandable and usable. By platforms, we mean the infrastructure that constitutes these fields, including such things as museums, galleries, publishing houses, and foundations. And by policies, we mean a range of interventions around culture, immigration, and urban development that influence the content and boundaries of national cultural fields. We find that even in cases where territorially bounded notions of national belonging dominate, transnational networks extend the production and circulation of national culture into the global art and literary worlds. Therefore, even in moments of heightened xenophobia and tightening borders, like the ones we're living through now, when a rooted, bounded nation is reasserted, its artistic and cultural producers and the policies and platforms in place to promote their work say otherwise. To varying degrees and with varying degrees of recognition, national culture is produced and promoted by actors in and outside the nation and the region. The dynamics we're describing take shape at a particular geopolitical moment. We live in a world on the move. Before the pandemic in 2020, there were 281 million people living voluntarily, and I put that in quotes, outside their countries of origin, up from 173 million in 2000 and 221 million in 2010. Refugees and asylum seekers who flee conflict, persecution, violence, or human rights violations also doubled from 17 to 34 million between the year 2000 and 2020. Rich states can't function without the many poor immigrants who do their dirty work and care for their children and elderly. Poor states can't survive without the remittances that these migrants send. This means, as you know, that more and more people live, study, and work outside their countries of origin for extended or short periods, and that there's a global competition for their labor and brain power. Furthermore, we live in a context shaped by centuries of colonial rule and extraction. The inequalities generated by the colonial project have, without doubt, been maintained and exacerbated under conditions of global capitalism. However, in the current moment, post-colonial projects have also taken shape across many localities, especially in the global South, and new alliances are being forged. So what we're seeing is a rise of global cities in previously peripheralized nations, a slow but uneven restructuring of global political, economic, and cultural power. The production, labeling, and dissemination of national culture and what it says about the changing boundaries of being and belonging occurs against this backdrop. We're interested in the relationship between nation and culture in the context of increasing mobility. In this world on the move, what work is national culture actually supposed to do, for whom, and where? Many scholars of nationalism and globalization have addressed related questions. They tend to discuss social policies surrounding immigration and citizenship, neglecting the role of art and culture. And they generally focus on the ways in which nation states have built, maintained, and used ties to their immigrants to strengthen their political and ontological status. We agree that nation states often strive to solidify and institutionalize ties between the homeland and its diaspora to achieve legitimacy and strengthen their position in the world. However, we take issue with this literature in three ways. First, we suggest that these are not the only kinds of transnational relationships through which national membership is reconfigured. Regions also play a critical role in mediating between the nation and the world. Within regions, shared experiences of colonialism, as well as common languages, institutions, and other cultural elements introduced under imperial rule can offer particularly important bases for transnational relationships and collective identities to take shape. These supranational identifications can fundamentally shape what national culture is assumed to be, who is allowed to create it, and what it is expected to represent. Second, we argue that though both diasporic and regional ties can be strategically used to uphold traditional nationalist schemes, they can also undermine them. Supranational imagined communities sometimes supersede national affiliations in the minds of national cultural producers and managers, and where multiple regions or diasporic nations compete for control, they can fragment the nation state, rendering it unviable. Therefore, we think it's important to consider how transnational relations and identities are used and towards what end across diverse empirical contexts. We propose that histories of colonialism, as well as migration patterns and economic factors, together shape how national culture is transnationalized and with what implications. Third, we focus on cultural institutions as opposed to social policies for several reasons. Cultural institutions have the potential to transform ways of seeing and belonging in unique ways as they structure the production and dissemination of objects to educate people, inspire emotion, and forge collective identities. These institutions often bear the burden of national representation, yet they vary in the degree to which they're regulated and controlled by nation states, involving a web of actors in both the public and private spheres. As such, there are spaces which, though constrained by political and economic factors, tend to leave room for creativity and transformation of traditional ways of seeing and being. Now, let me just say a little bit about our methods before I move on to the empirical cases. These data are part of a larger study on the cultural inequality pipeline that begins with the barriers to entry and circulation that artists and writers in the global South face, and that extends through to what gets taught in art history and comparative literature classrooms. We're studying South Korea, Argentina, and Lebanon for several reasons. The art world in each of these countries has become much more fully integrated into the global art market since the early 2000s. And the presence of contemporary writers has also increased as the global publishing world expands. These three cases also allow us to compare regional and temporal differences in integration into the global artistic and literary worlds. And these are all countries that have difficult historic histories and are dealing with a lot of political and economic turbulence in the past decades, and are using arts and culture to make sense of their experiences. We draw upon findings from more than almost 250 interviews conducted with artists and writers, publishers, gallerists, critics, and academics working in the art and literary fields that we carried out between January 2017 and March 2019. And we've done some additional interviews during the pandemic over Zoom, which is a very helpful thing. We also reviewed national government policies and researched the role of corporations, philanthropists, and foundations in showcasing and circulating national art and culture. And then we've created a number of databases. So one is to track the translations and what languages writers get translated to into, with paying particular attention to non-Western languages. Also, we have a database about the relationship between artists' migration and the migration of their work. So where does their work actually migrate to based on their places where they've gone to work and study? And finally, a database that's about the relationship between ethnic origin curators and gallerists and where artists actually have national and group shows. So I want to focus today primarily on South Korea just because of time limits, and then just talk very briefly about Argentina and Lebanon, but I'll be happy to go into more detail during the question and answers. So it's really a kind of national non-secret that Korea has really wanted to win the Nobel Prize for years. Ever since the Japanese author Kawabata Yusinari won this prestigious award in 1968, South Korea's competitive juices have been flowing, and an extensive, expensive infrastructure has been put in place to help the country achieve its goals. In 2016, the nation came the closest it had ever come when Han Gang won the International Man Booker Prize for her novel, The Vegetarian. And that same year, Cho Nam-ju published Kim Ji-young, born 1982, which went on to become an international bestseller and also was made into a film in 2019. Korea is a historically ethnically homogeneous nation. The state actively restricted long-term immigration and settlement. All this changed, though, as Korea's economic growth sped up and the country's birth rate declined. So it simply doesn't produce enough workers to meet the demands of its growing economy. The foreign-born population of just over 2.5 million now constitutes nearly 5% of the country's total population. And these include ethnic Koreans from China and Russia, and non-Korean origin workers from China, Thailand, and Vietnam. In response, and because such large numbers of Korean men are marrying foreign-born workers, the government adopted an official policy of multiculturalism. But this doesn't mean, however, like in Canada, that foreign-born groups receive support for maintaining their culture. Rather, it's about teaching foreign-born spouses how to become good Korean mothers and good citizens. Therefore, Korea is still imagined as a bounded, racially defined nation. And when newcomers are allowed in, ethnic Koreans are preferred. The country generally rejects regionalization. That is, even though there are some attempts to create like regional academic institutions or to hold regional East Asian book fairs or East Asian art biennials, most Koreans greet this with distrust. The country's history of domination by China and Japan is just too long and too painful. And so they really prefer to go it alone in the global race to the top. Therefore, according to Director of English Language Translation at the Literary and Translation Institute, which is the state's agency for supporting translations and training translators, Korean literature is defined as works written in Korean by writers working in Korea. It doesn't include work by ethnic Koreans living outside the country. Comparable efforts create strong boundaries around something called Korean art. A clear example is the meteoric rise of what became known as Dansekwa art. In the mid-1960s, a group of artists interested in struggles over national identity, belonging, and tradition began creating monochromatic works that ultimately took this name. Most worked valiantly, but in relative obscurity, with occasional shows in Asia until the early 2000s, when a kind of perfect storm took place. The new global art focus of the art world brought previously under-recognized artists and movements like Dansekwa into the spotlight. And there was a Korean-American professor, Joan Key, who wrote a book called The Contemporary Korean Art, Dansekwa and the Urgency of Method, which was the first English language account of this movement, which also made a very compelling case that Korea had its own version of monochrome art that was different from what was being done in Japan. Two major shows at the Kukcha Gallery in Seoul in August 2014, and then the Blum Poe Gallery in Los Angeles, that were both curated by Professor Key, received a great deal of attention. And so then lots of important institutions began collecting Dansekwa works, like the Art Institute of Chicago, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Guggenheim Museum in New York and Abu Dhabi, the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, DC, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Collectors took their cues from these international tastemakers, and the prices of Dansekwa art skyrocketed. I've never seen, said prominent art advisor Alan Schwartzman, the amount of widening interest in a particular circle of non-contemporary artists in historical material before. It was a no-holds-barred effort to create a national cultural product that could be clearly distinguished from its Japanese and Chinese counterparts. The state and private companies and foundations all play a role in advancing the national cause. And while they do so in service of national culture, and here's the important point, they get a great deal of help from a far-reaching cast of supporting actors with ties to Korea who live outside the country. And we see this in the people and policies and platforms that constitute the Korean cultural field. Let me begin with the policies. Today, there's an extensive state infrastructure that supports cultural production and exports. It supports museums, artistic residencies, international exhibitions of Korean art and translations of Korean literature, as well as alternative art spaces and a flourishing independent bookstore cafe sector. These policies produce and disseminate the national culture that will enable Korea to achieve its geopolitical goals. Just as electronics and cars transform Korea into a global economic powerhouse, so pop music, television dramas, and literature can also make it a cultural powerhouse. For example, Bartome Marty, the previous director of Seoul's Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art between 2016 and 2019, was hired to heighten the museum's international profile. Under his leadership, the museum launched an international publishing program and began to host international conferences because, he said, it's just what internationally recognized museums around the world do. And it's not just the state, but private corporations who support these efforts. The Hyundai Corporation is a case in point. According to Hyundai's vice chairman, Yoo-sun Chung, at Hyundai Motor, we understand that cars can provide much more than transportation. They can connect with people emotionally, and it is the same feeling that connects people to great art. Hyundai's efforts to emotionalize the brand translated into an 11-year partnership with the Tate Modern Museum in London, including the yearly Hyundai Commission in the museum's Turbine Hall and the creation of the Hyundai Transnational Research Center, both efforts to make sure that art from beyond the US and Europe get on display. While the fruits of these efforts are not confined to Korea, the country is certainly well represented among them. The director of the new research center is Korean-born Suk-hyun Lee, and she recently curated a big Namjoon Pike retrospective, and Korean-born Annika Yi won the Hyundai Commission in 2021. These examples reflect the important role that ethnic Koreans are playing in making and promoting Korean culture, and by so doing, expanding the boundaries of the nation. So even if many Koreans want to still see Korea as a ethnic, homogeneous, bounded nation, the fact that all of these people are being recruited to the cause of promoting national art is slowly eating away at the boundaries and the territorializedness of that nation. Annika Yi is Korean-born, but now lives and works in New York City. Suk-hyun Lee lives and works in London. Joan Ki, who coined the term Dansekwa, is Korean-American. And prominent artist Hae-gu Young credits her compatriot Rotterdam-based curator Bina Chow with giving her her start. Young herself lives and works between Korea and Germany. Because an international graduate degree is an informal requirement for a position at any Korean university, there's a generation of primarily US trained scholars who are writing art history and curating exhibitions or doing literary studies and translating Korean literature from abroad. The goal of greater cultural power is not being won by the worldwide popularity, not just being won by the worldwide popularity of K-pop or Korean soap operas. It also relies on the many ethnic Korean art makers and managers who have studied and worked in Europe and the United States. Even if these individuals are not predisposed to the cause, they're attracted by the money and resources the Korean government makes available to support it. It offers funding for research, exhibitions, residencies, or events in a world where they're increasingly scarce and therefore difficult to turn down. I want to close with one final example. Professor Young-Joon Lee, who's a former editor at the publisher Munumsa and a comparative literature professor who studied abroad but now works in Korea, maintains strong ties to Korean Studies institutes at US universities such as the Institute for Korean Studies or the Yenching Institute at Harvard. These ties give him access to the powerful platforms these institutions offer. So for example, Azalea, which is a journal of Korean literature and culture in English, which Professor Lee started, is published each year by the Korean Institute at Harvard with support from the International Communication Foundation in Seoul. During their stays abroad, these individuals like Professor Lee gain knowledge about the workings of the international publishing world and how to infiltrate it. Professor Lee knew that publishing a short story in an important magazine like the New Yorker or the Atlantic could be key to unlocking the door to greater circulation. The secret of success of Murakami, he said, was that his work was translated into English by a Harvard professor and then published in the New Yorker. So rather than trying to get novels translated and published, Professor Lee's strategy has become to promote short stories. Azalea tries to jumpstart the process by publishing directly in English. The main target is not just ordinary readers, but professors, translators, and researchers who will then learn more about Korean literature and serve as its future cultural brokers. Now, let me just say something briefly about Argentina and Lebanon before I move on to close. In the Argentine case, the city, the nation, and the region co-produce one another and coexist easily. They enhance rather than compete with each other. We see this in the thickening institutional ties and social networks that connect North America and South America. By expanding the boundaries of Latin American art, if not to include Latinx cultural production in the United States, but to be closer to it, the city, nation, and region all benefit from greater visibility and value, all benefit when greater visibility and value is attributed to the other. These strong regional ties grow out of a shared history, culture, region, and language. They're supported by long-standing and new intellectual and cultural infrastructures that broaden and thicken as the institutions that constitute them enhance their geographic scope. These include such things as the Sao Paulo Biennial, the Guadalajara Book Fair, Art Basel Miami, and the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, or FLACSO. They also include the well-recognized idea that there's something called Latin American literature that's exemplified in the Latin American literary boom. The national imaginary, therefore, easily nests itself within the region and depends upon the region's momentum for its own. The Lebanese case is the opposite. Like Argentina, the Lebanese national imaginary extends beyond the borders of the nation. At its most basic, that's because there are approximately 4 million people of Lebanese origin living outside the country and 12 million living inside the country and 12 million living outside it. Unlike Argentina, however, how and where that national imaginary extends is highly contested, echoing the deep divisions within Lebanon itself. Simply put, is Lebanon part of the West, building upon its public, polylingual, multi-confessional past that extends through Phoenicia, the Levant, the Mediterranean to Europe? Or is it part of the Arab, Muslim, and Christian world? Is Lebanese-ness an ethnicity, an artistic identity, and or a political affinity? And if so, who's managing these labels and how do they overlap? The ongoing struggles over how to answer these questions affect what national culture is, who creates it, and where it circulates in a number of ways. The answers differ for art and literature. In both cases, everyone with some kind of tie to Lebanon can claim to be and is claimed as a producer of Lebanese culture. But the national never goes it alone. Fractured politics and a dysfunctional state make it impossible to agree on what Lebanon stands for. National art circulates alongside other identities that the world has willingly provided. So since the 1990s, contemporary art produced by the post-war generation in Lebanon has traveled under many names: Arab, Middle Eastern, Middle East, North African, Muslim, Palestinian, designations given largely by outsiders. Each assignation connects the creator and her work to a political and cultural space beyond the nation, but it's a fractured space, mirroring the country's internal divisions. While artworks traverse the border between the West and the Arab world fairly easily, literary works tend to remain within the confines of the linguistic and cultural transregion, whether it's Francophone, Arabophone, or Anglophone. So to conclude, critical migration studies dismisses the transnational. Borders have closed, xenophobia and populism are on the rise, movement is more restricted. While that is true, we believe that the extent to which rich countries depend upon labor from poor countries and how much poor countries need the remittances they send home means that migration is here to stay. Even if state policies want to reassert more homogeneous bounded nations, we argue that cultural production and circulation work against that. In each of our cases, the national imaginary extends beyond the nation, sometimes enabled by the region and sometimes undercut by it. In Korea, the discursive and political articulation of the nation stands in sharp contrast to how its art and culture are produced. That is, in spite of its changing demography, Korea is still primarily imagined as a bounded nation defined by race. The global circulation of its cultural production, however, relies on a major cast of characters, many with ancestral ties to Korea living outside the nation. Therefore, the nation that most strongly promotes its national culture does so with a transnational army of artists, scholars, curators, and funders who aid its cause and by their presence redefine the boundaries of the nation. While there is some level of restage and regional institutionalization, it's not coupled with a strong regional identification. Born transnational, Argentina is a country of immigrants who maintained strong intellectual and cultural ties to Europe. It's also located in the region with a strong, in a region with a strong sense of self and cultural and intellectual infrastructure. It shares a history, culture, religion, and language with its neighbors. As its national impulses that have been in part boosted by its enduring ties to Europe weaken following decades of economic and political struggle, the region is an attractive alternative. Cultural creators can claim nation and region without conflict, as these imaginaries are co-produced. In fact, by doing so, the nation gains in prominence by benefiting from the region's recent expansion to include Latinx cultural production in the United States. Finally, Lebanon is a diasporic nation. 4 million people of Lebanese origin live inside the country compared to 12 million living outside. Like both of our other examples, it has also been plagued by continuous economic and political declines. In the Lebanese case, the region and the community of Lebanese living outside the world offer attractive alternative imaginaries to the deeply divided nation. They substitute for the nation rather than co-produce it, although the way the region is envisioned mirrors national divides. That is, the struggle over how Lebanon is imagined are reflected in which regional imaginary prevails. Is it part of the West or part of the Arab world? While art makers and managers move back and forth between these worlds, literature tends to circulate only within a particular linguistic and cultural transregion. Even so, Lebanese origin cultural creators everywhere are unquestionably included as producers of national art. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peggy, for this very stimulating presentation. So, as you may know, usually we have a little summarize in French because it is a bilingual seminar. So yes. I try to do that now, even though there's not the French speaker after you. So I do apologize for my approximations, but I intend to do that in French.
And I apologize for not being fluent enough to deliver a talk in French.
You're welcome. Ok, donc, comme je disais, j'essaie de faire un court résumé en français, comme le séminaire est toujours bilingue, même si aujourd'hui, la personne Claire Zal qui devait parler en français ne pourra pas être parmi nous, comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure. Donc, pour résumer ce qui a été dit, Peggy Levitt, donc, nous a expliqué qu'elle s'intéressait à la relation entre nation et culture dans un contexte de mobilité, de migration croissante. Et les questions qu'elle se pose, c'est que signifient aujourd'hui l'art et la littérature nationaux et quels sont leurs rôles dans la création des nations et leur positionnement sur la scène internationale. Donc, dans ce monde en mouvement, quel travail la culture nationale est-elle censée accomplir, pour qui et où? Donc, vous proposez d'explorer comment la culture nationale a été en fait transnationalisée dans les mondes artistiques et littéraires. Et vous allez prendre pour ça 3 villes qui seront vos terrains d'études pour essayer de comprendre la transnationalisation de l'imaginaire national. Alors, vous avez annoncé apporter 3 contributions à la recherche sur l'articulation entre culture et nationalisme. Donc, je reviens sur ces 3 points principaux. La première, c'est votre capacité à distinguer plusieurs façons dont la culture nationale est reconfigurée par les relations transnationales. Vous distinguez d'un côté le rôle de la diaspora à l'étranger, en précisant que les élites politiques et culturelles peuvent établir et activer des liens avec les membres de leur diaspora en faisant appel aux expatriés de façon à renforcer la position de l'État-nation dans le monde. Mais vous expliquez aussi que dans d'autres contextes, les liens et les identités régionales jouent un rôle plus important dans la médiation entre la nation et le monde. Et vous dites que le rôle de la région a été, selon vous, sous-estimé dans les études sur le nationalisme et le transnationalisme. Et alors, ce que vous entendez par région, c'est région supranationale, hein, parce qu'en français, on peut confondre région interne, et donc c'est les régions internationales. Et donc, vous soulignez qu'au sein des régions, les expériences partagées, notamment du colonialisme, ainsi que les langues et les institutions, et d'autres éléments culturels communs, qui ont été introduits sous les régimes coloniaux peuvent offrir des bases particulièrement importantes pour la formation de relations transnationales et d'identité collective. C'est une façon de réintroduire la question coloniale et post-coloniale dans cette analyse du lien culture et transnationalisation. Donc, ces identifications supranationales, qui sont formées par des liens régionaux plutôt que migratoires, peuvent, selon vous, fondamentalement façonner ce que la culture nationale est censée être et donc qui est autorisée à la créer, ce qu'elle est censée représenter. Ensuite, le deuxième grand apport de votre travail, c'est le constat selon lequel les effets de ces stratégies varient selon les contextes. Et vous expliquez que bien que les liens avec la diaspora et la région soient souvent utilisés pour renforcer l'État-nation, ils peuvent également, ces mêmes liens, miner l'unité et la viabilité de l'État-nation, et en particulier dans les contextes où des diasporas différentes ou des régions différentes se disputent pour un certain contrôle. Et donc, vous suggérez que les histoires du colonialisme, ainsi que les modèles de migration et les facteurs économiques, façonnent ensemble la manière dont la culture nationale est transnationalisée. Enfin, troisième grand apport, vous montrez comment ces nationalismes régionaux et de longue distance reflètent et sont reflétés par la production et la circulation de la culture, portée par des personnes, des infrastructures, notamment des musées, les galeries, etc., et des politiques dans les domaines littéraires et artistiques. Et donc, vous étudiez ces trois axes, en fait, à travers des travaux que vous avez menés sur 3 grandes villes mondiales que sont Buenos Aires en Argentine, Beyrouth au Liban et Séoul. Alors, vous avez choisi d'étudier ces 3 pays, la Corée du Sud, l'Argentine et le Liban, pour plusieurs raisons. D'une part, parce que dans le monde de l'art, ces 3 pays ont rejoint un marché mondial de façon très intense depuis les années 2000 et ça vous paraît particulièrement pertinent. D'autre part, ils vous permettent de comparer les différences régionales et temporelles dans l'intégration des mondes artistiques et littéraires. Et puis, vous expliquez que ce sont des pays avec des histoires difficiles, de turbulences politiques et économiques, et donc pour lesquels la culture représente un enjeu, notamment un enjeu sur le sens donné au passé de ces pays. Alors, je ne vais pas revenir dans le détail sur vos analyses. Je reprendrai en fait votre conclusion sur ces 3 pays, sur ces 3 enquêtes. Donc, sur la Corée, vous dites que c'est une nation, vous montrez à travers votre analyse que c'est une nation qui se définit à l'intérieur par le concept de race. On est coréen si on est un Coréen de l'intérieur. Mais en même temps, ce que vous montrez, c'est que son rayonnement culturel international repose sur une très grande hybridité. Vous parlez d'une armée transnationale d'artistes, de chercheurs, etc. qui portent cette culture mondialisée. Vous soulignez par ailleurs que pour la Corée, on n'observe pas d'identification régionale qui serait une identification à l'Asie du Sud-Est, mais qu'en revanche, Séoul est comprise elle-même comme une ville mondiale, comme une ville globale. Pour ce qui est de l'Argentine, vous montrez qu'au contraire, le monde culturel argentin s'inscrit dans une région, dans l'Amérique latine, et vous expliquez qu'il n'y a pas pour eux de conflit entre justement cette appartenance nationale et cette appartenance régionale. Il n'y a pas de conflit d'intérêts et au contraire, l'un alimente l'autre. Et vous revenez sur la question de Buenos Aires, qui reste quand même une ville centrale en termes de représentation de l'Argentine à l'étranger. Enfin, vous avez explicité le cas du Liban, qui est une nation diasporique, selon vous, du fait même qu'il y a plus de Libanais à l'extérieur qu'à l'intérieur du Liban. Et ce que vous montrez, c'est que ce qui est représenté du Liban par cette diaspora, finalement, n'est pas uniforme, mais qu'il y a des imaginaires différents selon l'image qu'on veut développer en fait de la nation libanaise, une image qui est à l'intérieur même du Liban controversée, puisque le Liban est tantôt représenté comme appartenant au monde arabe, ou tantôt représenté au contraire comme il y a une porte ouverte sur l'Occident, et qu'il y a aussi différentes identités nationales qui se disputent au sein du Liban et qui sont donc reprises, qu'on peut voir également sur la scène de la culture internationale. Enfin, en conclusion, ce que vous soulignez, c'est que les études critiques des migrations insistent sur le fait qu'aujourd'hui, il y a un retour des frontières, que le transnationalisme serait moins prégnant, etc. Mais ce que vous montrez, c'est que la migration reste très importante. On reste dans des relations de dépendance des pays du Nord et du Sud, notamment le besoin de main-d'œuvre dans les pays du Nord et le besoin de transfert dans les pays du Sud. Et que donc, dans un tel contexte, cette question de la transnationalisation reste première et reste donc très importante dans le monde même de la culture. Voilà pour le résumé. Je pense qu'on peut passer au débat. We can begin the discussion. Maybe, Camille, do you want to be l'animateur de la discussion?
Okay, fine. Thank you so much, Peggy, for this really interesting paper. And actually, I think it's really challenging for our group, because you really actually bring something to the critical approach by showing how I guess I don't know if it's only the French context, but sometimes transnational approaches have been highly caricaturized, and by bringing such a complexity, by showing the articulation between the national and the transnational. Also, I would say somehow disembedding the transnational approach from only migration approaches, but also to other objects and actors and institutions. I guess you bring much more complexity to the frame, and you help a lot, I guess, to discuss how we can articulate approach to research on transnational issues and processes. And I have many questions, but I want also to leave the floor to other persons. So maybe I just raise one first question, which is connected to your fieldwork, your empirical research. I was very curious about the interviews, and you mentioned you made around 200 interviews, which is impressive. And I was wondering a little bit about the question you raised and how you address the trajectories the persons you interviewed, and what is the connection between their trajectories and their projects somehow there, and also whether, I mean, you show extremely powerfully how there some of these actors are really transgressive. They transgress national narratives and borders. And so I was wondering to which extent they are conscious of the ways they are transgressive, or whether they are not conscious at all about the fact, the rules they have. And also I was wondering about the articulation between private and public actors, because I would imagine that public institutions and public actors are more connected to the national narrative, but I don't know if it's the case in every kind of context, or if it differs, and so on. Thanks a lot again.
Do you want me to answer now, or
I don't know. Maybe we can take or maybe we take another couple of questions and then you answer to.
Or maybe you could answer to Camille, and then we begin with the question with the.
Okay, because that was a lot of questions. So thank you. Thank you very much. You know, I've been watching this French television program called The French Village. It's about France in World War II. So I thought, like, okay, my French is really finally going to get good enough, but not good enough to, I could follow the translation, but not good enough to start answering back in French. So I'll keep trying next time, hopefully. Anyway, thank you for those great questions, Camille. The one about whether people are conscious about their transgressive projects is I think very much a yes. So the best example I can give you is from Argentina, where the most of the power in the publishing industry, you still have to get to from Buenos Aires to Mexico City via Madrid. So in other words, there are two major publishing powerhouses, but there is a whole independent publishing sector in Buenos Aires, despite its economic problems, where people are just publishing books for out of love, but some of them have actually built medium-sized viable publishing companies, normally bankrolled by someone with a bit of money, but it's a post-colonial project. And so they really are trying to circumvent the traditional centers and pathways to power, and also redefine what success is. So it's not necessarily getting to London or to New York anymore. It's, you know, having having something called Latin American literature actually circulate directly within Latin America. So, and I see a lot of these alternative visions in each of the cases. Now, the danger is, and I'll draw on Argentina again, that as soon as somebody is successful, so there are two alternative publishers that are fairly successful. Their model is being co-opted by Planeta and Penguin Random House, who now have like a boutique line that also tries to mimic a lot of the advantages and the you know, kind of literature that's being published. So it's hard the line between alternative or independent, as you know, gets pretty blurry the more successful that you become. So in terms of public and private actors, that's blurry too. So in the Korean context, even private corporations have to do public good. So you have all of these private corporations like the Liam Sangsung corporation that has its own museum and has a sort of commitment to do something good. Or there's the Daesun Foundation that is also paying for the for the translation and promotion of Korean literature. So here I think it's fair to say that Korean corporations are very much part of the scenario that I was describing, and also underwriting it. And when I said the piece about, you know, even if you don't want to be part of this, the fact that there's so much money there, it's very, very hard to resist. And then it's hard to answer your question about the circulation of the circulation of the artists and where do their work circulate to. That has to do with what you'd expect. So, you know, if someone goes to the United States to study at Rhode Island School of Design, like Wally Brad is one of the most famous Lebanese artists now, even though he's Lebanese American and spent most of his life in America, in the United States. But he went to study in the United States, and then his networks were in New York. So he knows how to work that scene much better than most of his colleagues. But then once you make that first step, I think what's interesting is to figure out then what's the secondary step, like what's the path dependency that's set up. So if you get to New York, is it really hard to get back to Europe? And now what we're seeing is that there's and I can't say this definitively because we're sort of right in the middle of analyzing it, but the younger generation gets to go, like the younger generations of Argentine artists is going to a wider spectrum of places, I think because of the both US facing and European facing pathways that have been laid down before. So I'll just stop at that.
Thank you so much. So who wants to raise a question? I'm looking at Thomas, and then anybody else, just to have an idea of how many questions we have. So let's start with Thomas.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peggy. It was absolutely wonderful. I think, just to re-embed your presentation within the series of seminars we had so far. So far, we had a lot of strong focus on borders, on critical what's going on, and also about violence, state violence. And we wanted to have you to offer a counterpoint to these approaches, and to move away from the spotlight of this what's going on at the borders and control policies, in order to present a view on the more long durée, maybe out of the radar, but widespread transnationalization of transnationalism trends. And so, yeah. I would like also to reinscribe your presentation within the trajectory of transnational studies. Because, well, if I remember well, in Nations and Bounds, they slightly address this issue of transnational cultures. And I think Nina Glischler and the other authors mentioned that they couldn't really find a body of literature which are truly transnational. It was really emergent, burgeoning. I think they were mentioning Salman Rushdie, for example. And you come back to this issue, but with a different questioning. It's not anymore the question of the rise of a transnational culture, but rather the transnationalization of national culture. So my first question would be, well, it's a bad question, I know, but I would like to have your reaction. Do you think that there is a change in the focus of transnational studies from the emergence of a transnational society to the study of what's transnational in the building of our societies? You see what I mean?
Say the last sentence again, sorry.
Yeah, do you think that in general, by and large, in transnational studies, there is a move from the study of the emergence of a transnational society with its network deterioration of social relations and so on and so forth, to now focus more on what is transnational within the fabric of our societies, of the Korean one, and so on and so forth. Do you think it's a general trend or not? That's my first question. And I've got another one, right? The second question is about what drives what is the motive of these national actors, especially the public actors and the private ones. Is it I got the impression, let me back to what I know best. It's the society, the cities. You know, the cities, cities and cities like global cities, they want to put forward their own cosmopolitanism. They want to rebrand themselves as very trendy, very welcoming, very integrative, and because it's good for their image, it's good for their money. They want to appear as very attractive. So this is part of very neoliberal ethos, because it's good for money making.
Yes, yes, yes.
So I was wondering whether these actors, they were driven by a neoliberal motive or by a transnational one. It is to say that the transnationalization of the cultural production is so strong now, it's so obvious that they have to adhere to it, they have to follow it. So yeah, there are two things at play here. So what is your view on it?
Okay, those are great questions. Thank you for them. And I want to just make sure everyone knows that Andrea is here, my co-author. And Andrea, you should feel free to jump in if you want to, because she is very much a co-author of these ideas. In terms of the history of transnational studies, I give you my own personal idiosyncratic view. I see us moving. I see there's a migration version of this conversation, and then there's a world polity version of this conversation. So Yasmin Soysal does not see herself as a migration scholar. She's looking at the transnationalization or co-production of the nation across borders that sometimes has to do with migration, but sometimes doesn't, right? So, and it's interesting to think about how those two sets of dynamics and then those two intellectual conversations talk to each other or not. But the way I see our field is that it started out as a noun and then it went to a verb, and now it went to an adjective and now it's a verb. And for me, it's a gaze, but I'll explain what I mean by that. So transnationalism, people talked about something called an ism at the beginning. And then there was a nuancing of that, which is, are you a transnational practice or a transnational migrant, and who's a transnational migrant? There was a lot of discussion about that. And now I see it as a verb because I see it as this co-production, whether it's the co-production of the national and the transnational, or and I see that happening in a context of an increasing transnational professional class that does a lot of this work, and a set of ideologies like neoliberalism that provide the backdrop of it and drive it forward. So maybe, but I also see it as a way of asking questions. So a long time ago with Sanjeev Kagram, we wrote in the introduction to the Transnational Studies Reader, this idea of an optic or a gaze, which is really about it's an answer to methodological nationalism, which is do not just ask the question without considering that it might have something to do with scales and scopes of experience that are outside the national borders. It doesn't mean it always does. It just means that if you don't ask the question that way, and if you don't hold all of those layers of social experience in conversation with each other, then you're likely to miss important parts of the story. And so I guess at the end of the day, I'll stick with that one about the gaze or the optic. And so that's my first thing. And your question about the neoliberalism, there's so many things going on here. So like in Korea, the part of what's going on is this use of national culture to get more political power, but that's also helped by a global education, a globalization of Korea policy that is very prominent in the higher university sector. That means that where they have all kinds of programs to globalize Korean higher education. And that's why you can't get a job unless you've studied abroad. And so that's also a piece of like exporting Korea and expanding its boundaries. And the third piece is exactly what you said about making Seoul into a global city that's attractive to expatriates who work for transnational corporations. That's gonna, continue to drive this economic transformation forward, or miracle, it already happened, forward. And that those people want museums and bookstore cafes and concerts. And so all of these things come together to drive forward this kind of transformation of the nation as it is, and who belongs and who participates. So, yeah.
Thank you, Peggy. We have a question from Swanie and a question from Renato in the chat. Maybe I can read Renato's question, and then we take also Fanny's question, just to take a couple of questions to fasten a little bit. Okay, so Renato is asking, so I was wondering about the role of the digital sphere. How is the digital sphere articulated in this analysis of transnational transformation of the national? What are the effects of the interactions and productions in the digital terrain on the notions and constructions of the tensions between national and transnational? Maybe we can also take Swanie's question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My question is very much linked to the one of Thomas. I was very interested in the concept of cultural power. And so I was wondering if a kind of cultural power could be autonomous from the economical power. And do you think cultural power is only, the other side of the same piece of the economical power, or do you think there is quite a kind of autonomy of this cultural power? And so my question is, do you think you can have cultural power coming from countries which are not like new economic power? Could you have a cultural power from poor countries which are not in growth?
Well, I think that's a great question, and that's sort of where the region comes in, right? Because Lebanon is getting a big boost from the Gulf. So who's got the cultural power? Who's got the economic power? What kind of compromises are people making by participating in what's going on in the emergence of the of the Gulf countries as cultural power, powerhouses. So, you know, there's an old expression that goes, Egypt writes, Lebanon publishes, and Iraq reads. And that was sort of like that's what I heard all the time in my interviews. But clearly that's changed because Lebanon and Egypt and Iraq are all in, you know, political and economic crisis. And what's holding them up is the rise, not the only thing that's holding them up, but what's giving them an injection is the rising set of resources like the Sharjah Biennial and all the museums that are in the Gulf that are drawing attention to that region. So, so autonomy with your hands tied. Like, I wouldn't want to say that you can't, that cultural power and economic power are coterminous, but I also wouldn't say that it's, you know, completely separate. And what I do see is that there are these sets of actors, and this goes to the earlier question about independent publishers or alternative publishers who are redefining what success means and trying to decenter the traditional places of power and opting out of the metrics of success. Now, do they mean it, or is it sour grapes? Like they tried and they failed, and so now they're doing revisionist history? Probably some. But I do believe that there are others who are really trying to re-envision and remake the landscape. And, you know, and that's a very interesting thing to see how that evolves over time. And maybe we're at a moment in this Black Lives Matter moment and Me Too moment of sort of global, you know, reckoning that will open up spaces that makes it possible for those kinds of efforts to survive longer than usual before they get swallowed up by the giants. I'm not sure. And the question about technology, I wish I had, first of all, Renato, I really like your Zoom portrait, but that's like a whole project in itself. And I'm only scratching that at the surface. So for example, one of the questions that I'm working on with some other colleagues is, you know, if so few books get translated into English and so few people read them, then how is it that you find out about these books? Like, what is happening in the book publishing industry that would make people exposed outside of their normal comfort zones? And we're looking at Goodreads. And so that's I don't know if you know what that is, but it's like a book recommendation platform that was started by this couple where people recommend books to their friends, and then they catalyze them, their shelves about particular topics and particular you know, parts of the world or genres and things like that. And so this is a technological innovation that helps people get exposed to other books or books that they wouldn't normally get exposed to, or the extent to which that is happening is an empirical question. Also, how people can publish all kinds of stuff online. And maybe that will be my next project, because it's a really good question about how that undermines the traditional gatekeepers and also opens up opportunities for more room. Give more perspective or insight on the thought. Yes. Can I answer that question that's in the
Yes, absolutely.
chat? That was how I guess the Middle Eastern cultural elites thought about cultural production in that region. And the reason why I mention it is that it does not include Saudi Arabia, and it does not include Qatar. And so that's sort of what folks are trying to say with that, I think, that, you know, who are these upstarts that we're financially dependent upon? They didn't have any culture, and now they're trying to invent it.
Other questions? We have 5 minutes left because we need to leave the platform at 25 past 5.
Well, if we have time, well, it's not really a question. It's only a remark. I think it would be interesting to work on the Netflix platforms. You know, I was very impressed about the diversity of the series proposed by Netflix, you know, and I saw quite recently, you say série, comment on dit des séries? Series, okay. Yeah. A series which was made, I don't know, I think it was in South Africa, but it was supposed to be an African series, like the first African series to be given to the world. And Netflix has done that quite a few times, you know, having an insight on a culture which were not globalized and which is supposed to become globalized through this series. I think that's very interesting. Don't know if you work on it or what you think about it.
Well, so I'll go back to the book example, because I don't know whether you saw, maybe you didn't, I'm sure you didn't, in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the kind of trade, it's the trade journal for academics. There was this very interesting article written by a woman, by Samana Roy or Ray. She's from India. And it was about how we ask readers like Salman Rushdie to be read as anthropology or sociology rather than art. And so watching a Netflix series about Africa and thinking that you're learning about Africa rather than experiencing as a film. And so what we're trying to do with the Goodreads, analyzing the reviews that are on Goodreads, is to see if there's evidence in the reviews about how people are engaging with these cultural objects. Like, is it voyeuristic reading, or is it reading as, you know, art? Like, oh, it's a story. I like the narrative, you know, because, and then who's writing about what? So is it a person who, because when I went to Ghana and I talked to people there, there's a writer named Ya Jessie, who, she actually just published a new book, and she wrote a book called Homecoming. And there was what was so striking to me when I had conversations about this. So I think she grew up mostly in Ghana, but now lives in the United States. So it was like an immigrant novel. So at the same time that people were proud that she had gotten this attention and Ghana is getting this attention, they were also like, you wrote this book for outsiders, not for insiders. Like, there's too much explained here that we can tell that you're writing it towards people like me who like to read those kind of books to learn something about a place. So all of these nuances about like what we expect books to do, and you know, whether we treat them as sociology or art, and you know, is that, what are the costs and benefits of that, I think are really, really interesting.
Thank you so much, Peggy. I think we have to stop. True, Swanie, we cannot take any more questions. Huh? It's time. Okay, so it was really great to.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And if anybody has any other questions they want to talk about, feel free to be in touch.
Thank you very much, Peggy.
Yeah.
Exchange again soon. Have a nice evening, everybody. It was the last session of the seminar. I don't know if we continue, if we go on next year, we'll see.
So many things to address. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it was.